Okay, so in the last video, you learned how to complete the square when you just have an expression that looks like this. You just learned what completing the square was. And what's cool about completing the square is that you can use that method to solve any kind of a quadratic, kind of like what I talked about before. You can use that to solve it, to figure out what x is going to be. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do in this video, is how to actually then solve it. So you can do this for any quadratic. You just first have to make sure it's in this form where you have x squared plus bx, and then it can be equal to any kind of number over here. Okay, so the only thing that you have to remember is to make sure that when you complete the square, when you tack on that c at the end, that you add it to both sides of your equation, right? Because in the last video, we were just working with an expression, so you just added the c on there. But here, since we're solving an equation, you have to make sure if you tack it on here that you tack it on at the other side of the equation as well. So you add it to both, okay? And then you'll end up factoring this and solving from there. So let's jump in and see how we can do that. So for example, this first one, it's in this form, which is good for us. We have x squared minus a b here equals d. We've got some number at the end. So what you're going to start by doing is just completing this square. So I'm going to take b, which is negative 16. And you want half of that, so I'll divide it by 2, which is going to give me negative 8. And negative 8 squared is 64. So that's my newly created c that I can then tack on the end there. I just have to remember I have to add it to the other side as well. So now what I have is x squared minus 16x plus 64 equals negative 15 plus 64, because I have to add it to this side also, is 49. Okay, so I've completed the square here. Now what you do in order to solve this, to figure out what x is you have to factor the left side and get it into be a perfect square binomial, or a square of a binomial. And since this is a perfect square, we can use patterns. We know this is really easy to factor. We know that it has to be x minus, because this is minus and this is a plus, 8. Because all you have to essentially do is take the square root here and take the square root here, and then you square that binomial. So you'll have 8 minus x squared is 49. All I've done is factored this. We've been working on factoring forever. You know how to do that. And I just did it using patterns because this is a perfect square. It was that 2ab thing that we had done before. Okay, so once it's here, this is just like what you learned yesterday. You're just solving for x, right? So the first thing I want to do is get rid of this squared. So I'll take the square root on both sides. That cancels this out here and leaves me with x minus 8 equals, the square root of 49 is positive and negative 7. Okay, so from here then, just like what you learned yesterday, is that you need to then break this down into two equations. So I'll have x minus 8 equals 7 and x minus 8 equals negative 7. So if I am solving for x, I'll add 8 to both sides, which is going to give me x equals 15. And when I add 8 to both sides over here, you end up with x equals 1. So your two solutions to this quadratic is x equals 15 and x equals 1. Okay, let's try one more example. The first thing that you're going to want to do is to complete this square. So I'm going to take b, which is negative 2, and I want half of that, which is going to give me negative 1, and then I square it. So negative 1 squared is positive 1. So this is my newly created c. I'm going to tack it on to the end here, and I also have to add it to the other side. So I'll have x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 3 plus 1 is going to be 4 because I have to add it to both sides. Now I can factor this. And because this is a perfect square trinomial, this is a perfect square, this is a perfect square, and there's a minus and a plus, I know that this factored is going to be x minus 1 squared, because I just took the square root of the first term, square root of the last term. So x minus 1 squared equals 4. And now I'm solving for x. So to get this by itself, I got to get rid of this squared first. So I'll take the square root, take the square root. That cancels this out, and I'm left with x minus 1 equals positive and negative 2. Square root of 4 is positive and negative 2. Okay, so now I can break this into two separate equations. X minus 1 is 2, and x minus 1 is negative 2. Add 1 to both sides, you get x equals 3, and if you add 1 to both sides over here, you get x equals negative 1. So your two solutions are going to be x equals 3 and x equals negative 1.